In small towns like Mill Creek, there is something older than the cobblestone streets and the family-owned taverns, a system that operates in the shadows, where strangers can vanish without a trace. A meticulously fine-tuned machine, lubricated by fear and greed, running so smoothly that no one ever questions it, no one except those who have been caught in its gears. The judge sat behind an old oak desk, the stack of files before him not cases, but sentences already decided. Welcome to Shadow Crime. Before we begin, please like the video and subscribe to the channel so we can continue creating even better content. Thank you so much. All right, let's get started. A simple system. If you were a stranger, if your skin was darker than a light cup of coffee, you were guilty. No trial, no witnesses, no real evidence needed. The law in Mill Creek was a luxury only a select few could afford. The town's police were artisans of storytelling. They planted evidence like farmers sowing seeds, carefully, skillfully, ensuring that the harvest always served their interests. A dagger accidentally found in a traveler's trunk. A small bag of white powder quietly resting in a visitor's glove compartment. A sloppily doctored photograph, but just convincing enough to turn an innocent man into a dangerous criminal. To them, the truth was irrelevant. What mattered were the arrest numbers, the fines, the convictions handed down without opposition. This system had thrived for 20 years, evolving and operating like a flawless machine. No one had the power to dismantle it, and no one was foolish enough to try. Anyone who spoke up quickly became just another forgotten name on the prisoners' list. The walls of Mill Creek's prison didn't just confine people with bars, but with despair. But there was one thing its creators never anticipated. The machine they had built had no concept of predator or prey. Once programmed to destroy, it would continue to devour, regardless of the target. And when the line between the manipulators and the victims began to blur, the inevitable would happen. The ones who controlled the game would become mere pieces in their own twisted design. Mill Creek had swallowed countless fates. But would there come a day when it finally consumed itself? When Malcolm Hayes was arrested in Mill Creek, the police saw only a familiar face. A brilliant, a black man, a stranger, an easy target. To them, he was no different from the ones before him. Another victim swallowed by the grinding gears of the system, chewed up and spat out like a nameless criminal. What they didn't know was that this time, they had chosen the wrong man. Malcolm was no nobody. He wasn't just another lone traveler who had wandered into the wrong town. He had a brother, Lincoln Hayes, the United States Attorney General, a man powerful enough to pick up the phone and send an entire town into a panic, a man capable of tearing apart the system they had so carefully built over 2 decades. But the Mill Creek police didn't know that. They also didn't know that this game was no longer theirs to control. They arrested Malcolm on a drizzling afternoon, staging the same setup they had used 100 times before. An officer pulled him over at a random checkpoint, smiling as if it were just routine. Minutes later, they coincidentally found a small bag of drugs hidden in his trunk. A perfect trap, except for one thing. Malcolm wasn't afraid. He didn't beg, didn't resist, didn't fall into the panic they were expecting. He just stayed silent, his eyes steady, as if committing every detail to memory. They dragged him into the interrogation room, where an officer with a crooked badge smirked and recited a speech he had memorized long ago. "We have evidence, we have witnesses. Cooperate, plead guilty, and things will be easier for you." Malcolm leaned back in his chair, his gaze sharp as a blade cutting through the silence. "I want to make a phone call." They laughed. In Mill Creek, the law was a luxury. Here, the police were the law, and their law said he wouldn't get a call, wouldn't see a lawyer, wouldn't have a chance to get out. But Malcolm didn't need to call, at least not yet. He simply watched. He memorized the faces of every officer who stepped into the room. He noted every word, every smug glance they exchanged. He picked out who was in charge, who followed orders, who enjoyed the cruelty of the system. They thought he was powerless, but in reality he was gathering his weapons. A trapped animal isn't always prey. Sometimes it's just waiting for the right moment to strike. After hours in custody, Malcolm Hayes was finally granted a phone call, a privilege the Mill Creek police assumed he could do nothing with. But within minutes of dialing, everything began to change. On the other end of the line, Jordan Hayes didn't need much explanation to understand what was happening. As one of Attorney General Lincoln Hayes' senior aides, she only had to hear 2 words, Mill Creek, to know this wasn't a random arrest. Without hesitation, Jordan escalated the case up the chain. Within an hour, the FBI was involved. The investigation started in Mill Creek, but it didn't stop there. Soon, it expanded to 12 other towns across multiple states, all operating under the same sinister model: unlawful arrests, fabricated evidence, a corrupt justice system, and private prisons profiting off the misery of the innocent. How did this machine operate? Unjustified arrests to meet quotas. Town police were given monthly arrest quotas. The numbers didn't matter as much as the names. They didn't care who the real criminals were, as long as someone got arrested. Strangers, especially those with no local connections, were the perfect targets. Fabricated evidence to force guilty pleas. No evidence? No problem. Mill Creek officers could create it with ease. A knife magically appeared in a glove compartment. A bag of drugs was conveniently found under a car seat. Video footage was edited in just the right way to incriminate. If someone refused to plead guilty, they were beaten, threatened, or simply held indefinitely without trial. Corrupt judges and prosecutors. No one escaped the system because those who upheld the law were part of it. Judges and prosecutors worked together to ensure every conviction benefited the machine. Defense attorneys rarely stood a chance to truly help their clients. Asset forfeiture as a cash cow. Once convicted, a person's assets became fair game. Cars, cash, homes, anything could be seized under the guise of criminal involvement. These assets were sold to those with ties to the system or funneled directly into the pockets of the corrupt. Private prisons profiting from mass incarceration. Private prisons had contracts with local governments, receiving funding based on the number of inmates they housed. More prisoners meant more profit. That meant they needed a constant supply of new inmates, and Mill Creek was one of their most reliable pipelines. But this time, they had made a fatal mistake. They had targeted the wrong man, and as the light of justice began to shine into Mill Creek's darkest corners, the machine no longer ran smoothly. It began to crack. When the FBI stormed into Mill Creek, they weren't just looking for financial records or bribe transactions. They wanted the full truth, and the truth was always buried in the files no one wanted to see. In a dusty records room beneath City Hall, they found documents that didn't exist in any official system. Yellowed pages recorded deaths that had never been investigated. Suicides in prison, all following the same pattern. No prior signs of depression, no notes left behind, no inquiries conducted after the fact. The forgotten names now became living proof of a much larger crime. Prisoners who had resisted, demanded fair trials, or simply knew too much, all permanently silenced. Evidence of a system not just corrupt but murderous in its effort to protect itself. These discoveries triggered a domino effect. Officials who once thought themselves untouchable now faced 2 choices: stay silent and sink with the ship, or confess and search for an escape. And as human nature dictates, loyalty only lasts until the threat of real punishment arrives. The first confessions. The first to break was a district prosecutor. He walked into the FBI office, pale-faced, demanding immunity in exchange for information. He spoke of how he was paid to ensure every conviction served the system, how judges were bribed to deny appeals, how critical files conveniently disappeared when needed. Then, a high-ranking officer from the Mill Creek Police Department followed. He brought a hard drive filled with emails and internal messages. A treasure trove of evidence revealing the entire system operating like an organized crime syndicate. The fall of Mill Creek's courts. Judges who once sat high on the bench now found themselves in interrogation rooms, forced to answer for their decisions. Mysterious wire transfers to secret accounts, late-night meetings with private prison executives, unexplained luxury gifts, all were exposed. Some judges denied everything. Others remained silent. But when one fell, the rest couldn't stand for long. The market collapse. In the world of finance, news travels faster than the law. As the scandal hit the press, stocks of private prison corporations, companies that had made millions from imprisoning the innocent, plummeted. Major investors rushed to pull out. The government froze millions of dollars in accounts linked to the investigation. An entire industry built on crime was crumbling before their eyes, and nothing could stop it. Mill Creek had once been a place where justice was twisted for profit, but now it was becoming the symbol of a rotten system finally being exposed. And those who once believed they were the hunters were now realizing they had been the prey all along. The scandal in Mill Creek shook the entire justice system, but the truth was far more terrifying than what the FBI and the Department of Justice, DOJ, had imagined. The individuals arrested in this small town, the police, judges, prosecutors, were merely expendable pawns. The true masterminds behind the game had yet to reveal themselves. In the upper echelons of power, where lavish wine parties and discreet handshakes determined the fate of thousands, there was a secret project known as Project Legacy. Project Legacy, a machine that could swallow a nation. The system that operated in Mill Creek was not an isolated event. It was merely a trial run, a small-scale model for a much larger plan. Private prison executives, politicians with hidden agendas, and international investors saw an opportunity, a justice system that turned innocent people into commodities. They wanted to expand this model nationwide, an America where anyone could be arrested without cause, where private prisons became a highly profitable industry, where the law was nothing more than a tool for corporate gain. Project Legacy was designed to legalize what Mill Creek had done in the shadows. New laws were proposed, friendly judges were appointed, and politicians received campaign donations to stay silent. If this plan succeeded, an entire generation would be trapped in a system with no escape. But they never expected Mill Creek to collapse so quickly, and when the FBI followed the trail, Project Legacy was no longer a secret. The ones who ran. As classified documents were exposed, the most powerful figures in the system knew they couldn't just sit still. They started covering their tracks. Servers at private prison corporations suddenly suffered technical failures. Critical files vanished from law offices. Millions of dollars were withdrawn from banks and transferred to offshore accounts. Some high-ranking figures decided to flee. Private jets were booked, fake passports prepared. A top executive of a major private prison corporation planned to escape the U.S. by yacht. A politician involved in the scheme tried to fly to a country without an extradition treaty with the United States. But the FBI was one step ahead. Nowhere to hide. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, working alongside the Department of Justice, froze all accounts linked to Project Legacy. Arrest warrants were issued nationwide and special task forces were deployed. At the airport, an international investor, one who had poured hundreds of millions into this system, was handcuffed just as he was about to board his private jet. On the docks, FBI agents stormed a luxury yacht, pulling off a trembling CEO, champagne glass still in hand. And a once powerful politician who had been certain of his untouchable status was arrested in his own home, moments after shredding a stack of incriminating documents. The System Collapses Project. Legacy was no longer an expansion plan. It had become a crime laid bare before the public eye. Those who once believed they could manipulate the entire country were no longer standing at the pinnacle of power. They were dragged to the very bottom of the system they had created. The scattered arrests had set off a political earthquake. But as the FBI continued to follow the trail, they didn't just uncover corrupt players operating in the shadows, they exposed an entire empire built to sustain this system. And standing at the top of that empire was none other than Senator Charles Phillips. Senator Phillips, the architect of a criminal machine. To the public, Phillips was a respected politician, a champion of law and order and strict sentencing policies. He had been praised for his tough-on-crime stance, but the truth was far darker. He wasn't just a part of this system, he was the one who built it. Phillips used his influence to appoint corrupt judges, manipulate prosecutors, and craft legislation that fueled the rise of private prisons. He had orchestrated policies that turned small towns like Mill Creek into relentless money-making machines. And when the FBI found the evidence, offshore payments, emails directing prison executives, secret meetings with private sector CEOs, his fate was sealed. When agents stormed his office in Washington, D.C., Senator Charles Phillips was in the middle of a meeting with lobbyists. He stood up, trying to maintain his composure, but his eyes betrayed him. They had all thought they were untouchable. But when the cold steel of handcuffs locked around his wrists, all illusions of invincibility shattered. Darius and Jordan facing a bigger war. As news of Philip's arrest spread, Darius and Jordan knew the fight was far from over. Mill Creek was just a fragment of a decades-long operation. Jordan laid out stacks of documents, fabricated cases, intimidated lawyers, innocent people crushed by the system. "This isn't just about a few towns," she said, her voice heavy with realization. "We're talking about an entire empire." Darius nodded, his expression sharp. "Then we bring it down." They were no longer just chasing crooked cops or bribed judges. They were hunting the true masterminds, the financial giants who bankrolled the system, the politicians who passed laws to keep it running, the investors who profited from thousands of wrongful imprisonments. This wasn't just a fight against Mill Creek. This was a fight against a machine that had existed for decades. The war has just begun. They weren't alone. As the truth spread, those who had once been too afraid to speak out began to step forward. Forgotten victims, former investigators silenced by threats, lawyers who had been forced into submission. Now, they were all coming together. Mill Creek was just the beginning. A movement had begun, and this time, the ones lurking in the shadows had nowhere left to hide. The system that the powerful had built in the shadows for decades had been ripped apart. The darkest secrets were exposed. Corrupt courts were shut down, police departments were purged, private prisons, once money-making machines, now stood abandoned, with no one left to imprison. Those who once held power, who gave the orders, who counted their wealth atop the suffering of thousands, were now facing justice. But the fight wasn't over yet. The resistance of the powerful. When a system collapses, those who profited from it don't go down without a fight. The financial empires, the politicians, the architects of Project Legacy knew that if Darius and Jordan continued, they would lose everything, and so they fought back. A smear campaign erupted. Headlines twisted the narrative, painting Darius and Jordan as radicals, as threats to social order. Threats followed. Anonymous emails, strange cars parked outside their homes in the dead of night, a cyber attack targeting the FBI's database, a desperate attempt to erase the remaining names before they could be exposed. But Darius and Jordan didn't stop. A justice revolution. As more cases were brought to light, the public awakened. This was no longer just an investigation. This was a revolution. Towns that had once been ruled by fear now dared to rise up. Former police officers who had been silenced spoke out. Innocent people who had been wrongfully imprisoned returned to reclaim their justice. It was no longer a lone investigation. It was now a movement. Darius watched the crowds gathering outside the courthouses, chanting for justice. He knew this battle had grown beyond anything he had imagined. Jordan held a new file in her hands, a list of the remaining names, the ones who had yet to fall, the ones who still clung to power. She smiled, fearless. "Let's finish this." Unleashing the tiger. The masterminds behind this system had once believed they were the hunters. They thought Mill Creek was just a small scandal, that Darius and Jordan were nothing more than meddling nuisances that could be silenced. They were wrong, because they hadn't hunted anyone. They had released a tiger into the wild, and this time, they were the prey. This story isn't just a typical crime investigation. It's a journey to overthrow an empire of corruption, a machine designed to consume human lives for profit. What began in a small town, where justice was nothing more than an empty word, quickly grew into a revolution against a system that had existed for decades. What makes this story so compelling isn't just its tightly woven conspiracy, it's the chilling realism. A system like this isn't just fiction. It mirrors what has happened, what is happening, and what could happen in reality. The idea of a justice system twisted to serve profit is not far-fetched, and that's what makes this story both thrilling and deeply unsettling. Darius and Jordan are more than protagonists. They represent the few who dare to stand against an untouchable power. They aren't superheroes, but they possess something far more terrifying, an unyielding will. They don't fight with guns or brute force. They fight with truth, with persistence, with an unshakable desire for justice, the most powerful weapon that those in control fear the most. But what I love most about this story is how it ends. Not with a clear victory, but with an unspoken truth. The fight never truly ends. Those who built this system believed they controlled everything, but what they didn't realize was that they had released a tiger into the wild. That image carries weight, because once the truth is exposed, it can never be buried again. This story isn't just a gripping thriller, it's a wake-up call. Justice doesn't arrive on its own. It only exists when someone is willing to fight for it.